Chapter 12, Recording Part 2. From Stores and Catalogs. Small country stores had a variety of goods for sale. Homesteaders depended on the stores for basic products such as cloth, tea, salt, sugar, and flour. Saturday was the typical day for going to town to buy products. If families could afford it, a small bag of candy for about 5 cents might be bought as a treat for the children. In a box in the garage, I found an old catalog from a company called T. Eaton Company. It showed all kinds of neat items from the past. Dad explained that in the late 1800s and through much of the 1900s, people studied the pages of the Eaton's catalog. For many people, especially those living out in the country, it was their wish book. Many boys wished for the hockey equipment and bikes. Many girls wished for the clothes. Girls would also cut out the figures to make paper dolls. Which item do you think each member of a homesteading family from the early 1900s would select from a present-day catalog? Explain your answer. A town begins, San Gudo. In 1910, the Alberta family floated on a raft down the Pembina River from Eaton's Whistle to San Gudo. A railway had just been built to the San Gudo area, and it would be bringing homesteaders on the raft were goods for starting a store. The Alberta General Store had long counters on both sides. One side had food items. Tins were stacked on the shelves. Bags held sugar, flour, rice, coffee, and beans. Eggs and farm-made butter were also sold, as there was nothing to keep things cold. Milk and meat were not available. There were dry goods too. These included bolts of cloth, clothing, boots, and shoes, and household items. Hardware was also sold. A central coal stove kept the store heated, and coal oil lamps provided lights. At the back of the store was the post office. The Alberta General Store was like the general stores in many other towns. This photo shows the general store in Bykescur, Alberta, in 1912. Businesses such as a bank, a creamery, lumber yards, butcher and barber shops, and a drugstore were opened in the 1920s. Soon a hotel and a school were added. A doctor arrived and a newspaper started. An important feature of the town was the grain elevator alongside the railway. Challenges and changes. What changes affected the quality of life in Alberta? A number of things changed Alberta farming. New types of equipment made farmers' work easier and more efficient. Two new types of wheat, red fife and marquise, were developed. Both grew more quickly than other types. There was less danger of having crops ruined if winter lasted too long or came early. Also, the new wheats had fewer diseases. Equipment changed too. New plows had several blades instead of one. This meant plowing could be done faster. Seed drills were also created. These cut lines into the soil and dropped the seeds. Drills also covered the seeds with dirt to protect them from the wind and birds. Harvesting had once been done by hand, and grain was separated from the stalk by plenty of hard labor. By the 1890s, threshing machines were invented that would do this work. In the 1900s, thousands of men and boys came to Alberta to work on threshing machine crews. Grain would be loaded onto wagons, and horses would pull them to the nearest elevator. New machines were made to cut the wheat and form tied bundles called sheaves. Drought. Farming has always been affected by nature. In the 1930s, hail and grasshoppers wiped out thousands of kilometers of crops. There was also a severe drought. The soil became so dry it blew away in the black dust storms. Many farmers gave up and walked away from their farms to find work in towns and cities. Dust storms like this one in Lethbridge blew through many communities in the 1930s. Unemployment. During the 1930s, business was bad both in Canada and the United States. The name used for this period is the Great Depression. People across Canada experienced difficult times. In 1928, the average amount of money earned per person was $548 per year. This dropped to $212 per year in 1933. People needed jobs. People from the cities moved to the countryside, and people from the country moved to the cities. There were very few jobs anywhere. Some unemployed single men were sent in the railway cars to work camps in British Columbia. Others worked in Alberta on projects created by the government. For instance, in 1933, workers in the Cooking Lake area loaded clay that would be used to build a provincial highway. A relief program was also started in Alberta. A Calgary family of five, for example, would be given $60 to help them pay expenses for the month. When they could not afford to put fuel in their cars in the 1930s, people came up with creative solutions. Memories of a Lacombe childhood. My name is Scott Reed. I was born in 1923 in Lacombe. Although times were hard in the 1930s, life could also be grand, especially for some children. Lacombe had no swimming hole, so we learned to swim in Jackfish Lake or Gull Lake. We all did lots of sports. Baseball was another summer favorite. We didn't have league teams, but somehow the word would get around and pretty soon we would get a game going. Sometimes for fun, we'd have a paper chase. I was a swift runner, so I'd often be the one to get started. I'd have a bag of small pieces of torn paper. I'd get a head start and toss small handfuls out of the bag as I ran. The kids following chased after, following the paper trail. They would try to catch me, but I'd try and trick them by doubling back. In the summer, Lacombe had a town fair. There were horse races and food booths. Children saved the nickels they had earned from collecting gopher tails and crow or magpie eggs. I remember when the first bottles of cola were sold there. In the summer of Chautauqua came through. This was a group of people who traveled with a tent. Their acts included magicians, singers, comedians, and jugglers. The Chautauqua always started with a town parade. There were prizes for things like the best decorated bike or the child who could keep a yo-yo going the longest. I remember once hearing a comedian say, "You think Lacombe is a small one-horse town? Well, you haven't cleaned the streets yet." In the winter, Lacombe had great senior hockey because we had great players. Our male teachers, I think, the town purposely hired teachers were also skilled hockey players. It seemed like boys always wanted a hockey game going. Outside of school time, the equipment was pretty basic. Some kids had skates, some didn't. We all used Eaton's catalogs for shin pads. Of course, in those days, helmets weren't commonly used yet. Some Lacombe boys joined a hockey team. I once made a bobsled out of wood slats and iron runners. There wasn't a bobsled hill in Lacombe, but there was in Red Deer. I competed a lot with a girl named called Jean. My sled was faster, but she could really steer. Children in many of Alberta's communities enjoyed sledding in the winter. We had lots of games that didn't need any equipment, except perhaps a ball. We played anti over, kick the can, tug of war. How was childhood different for Scott Reed and Manya Oksevich? Why might that be? World War II, 1939 to 1945. In 1939, Canada joined the other countries in declaring war on Germany for its attack on countries in Europe. In 1941, Canada again joined with other countries in declaring war against Japan for its attack on countries in the Pacific Ocean region. People from communities all over Canada, including Alberta, worked and fought for Canada between 1939 and 1945. Japanese Canadians. When the war started, most Japanese Canadians lived along the British Columbia coast. Japanese men worked at logging camps, at sawmills and mines, on the railway, and as fishermen. Often wives and children moved from Japan to join them. Many families set up shops or farmed. Due to the fear caused by the war, these people were moved to special camps during the war. About 2,500 Japanese Canadians were sent to Lethbridge to work on sugar beet farms. The camp houses were poorly made and the winters were cold. The homes, businesses, and farms of the Japanese Canadians were taken away and sold. They were only allowed to keep a small amount of their money and what could be held in 2 suitcases. At the end of the war, many Japanese Canadians stayed in the Lethbridge area. In 1988, the Canadian government apologized for the way Japanese Canadians were treated during the war. In 1967, Lethbridge opened the Nika-Yuko Japanese Garden. The name means Japanese and Canadian friendship. Why is it important that the Canadian government apologize to Japanese Canadians? Manya Aksukevich during wartime. You were introduced to Manya on page 265. Her letters told of some of her experiences when she first arrived in Canada as a young girl. On this page are memories of her life as a young woman during the war, as told to her daughter. The war made a huge change in my life. We didn't hear anything from the Ukraine during the whole period of the war. My stepfather got tuberculosis in 1941. He died in a hospital in Edmonton, but we didn't have the money to pay for his care. Like many people, I went to work at the hospitals as a nurse, a nurse's aide to pay off the debt. I joined the Canadian Women's Army Corps when the debt was paid. I was sent to Calgary where I trained as a secretary. Friends of mine did jobs like refueling airplanes used for training pilots. Alberta was the center for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Pilots and men who worked on the planes came to Alberta from around the world. Some of my friends married these men. Johnny and my brother had stayed behind to farm as his war effort. At the farm, life was difficult. Certain items like sugar and gasoline were in short supply. They were rationed, which meant people were only allowed to buy a small amount. After the war, many officers stayed in Alberta. Shortly after the war, I married a man named Scott Reed. I don't think life for Albertans was ever the same. Women had become used to working outside the home. Many returning servicemen moved their families to cities. This is a picture of Manya. Many Alberta men married overseas. Their wives and children arrived in Canada on ships and trains. Chinese Canadians. The story of Chinese Canadians in Alberta has taken place over many years. It is a story of sadness and joy. I think that when we tell stories about people, we sometimes need to tell the parts of stories that hurt. We need to know about sorrows to learn from them and make changes. From 1858 to 1870s, many Chinese people immigrated to Canada to work. They came to work as laborers, cooks, and wagon drivers from 1881 to 1885. Over 1,500 Chinese men came to work on the railway as laborers. When the railway was finished, many went to southern Alberta to look for new jobs. Some people worried there would not be enough jobs for everyone. The government decided to limit the number of new Chinese immigrants starting in 1885. Chinese immigrants were charged a tax for entering Canada. This was called the head tax. At first, the tax was $50. In 1903, it was raised to $500. Most Chinese immigrants could not afford to buy land or farm or ranch. Instead, they took jobs as cleaners, cooks, and laundry workers, and vegetable growers. All of these were poorly paid jobs. Although some people appreciated the contributions of their Chinese Canadian neighbors to Alberta's communities, not everyone treated them with respect. Prejudice means to dislike or distrust a person or group without knowing enough about them. Discrimination means treating people differently because of the group or groups they are members of. Chinese Canadians face discrimination in Alberta. For example, during the Great Depression, people received relief payments of $2.50 per week. Unemployed Chinese Canadians were only given $1.12 per week. Some people put pressure on the government to be fairer, and Chinese Canadians were given $2.12 per week on relief. In 1923, Chinese immigration to Canada was almost completely banned. During World War II, China became one of Canada's allies. Each country needed the other.